The discussion of race, police brutality, and equality has been in the forefront since the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, and George Floyd. But it was Floyd's death that truly sparked the serious discussions about race and police brutality we are having now. It's also raising questions on how racial injustices are covered, how often they're covered, and who is covering them. That was the topic of an episode of The Takeaway, produced by WNYC and Public Radio International, focusing on the toll of covering police brutality as a Black journalist. That show is hosted by Tanzina Vega, and she joins me now from New York City. Welcome, Tanzina. It's really great to have you with us. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me on.
If you wouldn't mind talking about some of the challenges Black journalists are facing specifically while covering these stories involving Black deaths at the hands of police officers or even vigilantes.
I think we need to keep in mind that a lot of the issues that we're seeing outside of newsrooms are playing out inside newsrooms today. And I've said this repeatedly. There is a lack of diversity in many of the newsrooms across the country, particularly the higher up we get in terms of top management positions, stories that are accepted, stories that people are able to tell. But there's also a human toll of watching, of separating your identity from what you're covering and from the realities happening outside of a newsroom. When you are seeing people who are from your community and look like you and could be, related or friends of yours being killed repeatedly in such a way, and seeing these videos over and over and over again, that begins to take a toll. I think what we're also seeing here is a real questioning of what's considered objective journalism and what isn't.
You had a good turn of phrase at one point where you said, I believe it was Christiane Amanpour that you quoted saying, I prefer to cover truth I prefer to report what is truthful rather than what is neutral. I may be misquoting you a little bit, but could you expand on that?
Sure. I think one of these issues about objectivity is that the news media has often been dominated by, and really, the highest positions that we see are generally white folks who are very highly educated, who often come from some of the most prestigious universities out there. That is what sets the tone for what's considered objective. And what we have to do is expand that lens. What Christiane was referring to is we're in a moment right now where journalists are being tasked with this idea of objectivity in a moment where the idea of objectivity itself is being questioned. We have to report on what is truthful, not this false idea of neutrality. And when you look at the data, when you look at numbers, when you look at the people who have been killed at the hands of police officers, when you look at the wealth discrepancy in the United States, when you look at all of these issues that combined create what is called systemic racism, it's not something that requires neutrality. It's truthful to say that Black Americans collectively have less wealth than white Americans. And what that effect is on these communities is the truth. It doesn't require someone to be yes or no, or either or show both sides. The numbers tell the story that is truthful and not neutral.
And do you feel that, journalists of color right now are hesitating to sort of be that direct with the truth, as you point out, for fear of appearing as if they lack the objectivity that you described of a previous, incarnation?
I think what journalists of color are doing is finally saying this standard in and of itself is not objective. The standard of objectivity in and of itself is a false premise. And so journalists of color are often, and myself included, are often called on to teach, to explain, to facilitate some of the most difficult conversations that are happening across the country right now. We are the ones who are often set out to the front lines to cover these protests and this uprising that we're seeing. And yet, sometimes when we come back to our newsrooms, we're not given the same amount of journalistic support or the assumption that we do understand this community. We do know that our lived experiences often reflect what we're seeing out of the newsroom itself. So that disconnect has to be fixed.
And you were on the ground during the 2014 uprising in Ferguson, Missouri, after Michael Brown's death. Now, in terms of coverage, what do you think is the same or different since then?
I can tell you the phrase systemic racism and hearing that phrase being used across in newsrooms across the country is one of the first that I've heard. I can tell you that news organizations that are re-examining how is from seemingly small things like capitalizing the B when they refer to Black Americans and Black people, things like the Los Angeles Times that recently wrote an editorial saying Black Lives Matter, things like what Axios did in saying allowing its staffers to participate in Black Lives Matter gatherings and protests. And part of that is because newsrooms are trying to draw the line between what's considered political protests, which is something we are not allowed to participate in across the board, and what's really considered human rights here. And when we're talking about Black Lives Matter, are we talking about a political message that we shouldn't be supporting, or are we just reflecting the humanity of a community that has for the entire founding of this nation has not been considered to matter? And so I think what you're seeing, the conversations that are playing out in newsrooms across the country are going to have an effect on the stories that you're reading.
And Tanzina, on Monday, my colleague Lana Zak asked the president of the National Association of Black Journalists, Dorothy Tucker, what she thinks is missing from newsrooms today. And let's listen to what she had to say.
Hire more Black managers. We have got to have more African Americans in top positions, in leadership positions in our newsrooms, so that we can have better coverage of the Black community, so that the racism and the discrimination that some of our Black reporters go through will not be as bad, will not be existence anymore.
So, Tanzina, do you agree with Ms. Tucker?
100%. I mean, I think that that's really the issue. And it's not always a question of hiring people to come in as interns. And while that's really important, the real decision-making power happens, as you all know, at the executive editor level, at the top editor level. And it's not just about having one or two people in positions of power. It's also creating institutional support so that journalists of color and Black journalists in particular are allowed the same freedoms and flexibility to explore, to do well, to not do well, to know that the organization has their back, and also to expand into other topics. We need to see more Black journalists and journalists of color covering politics, covering technology, covering science, covering healthcare, areas that often are really dominated by non-Black journalists and non-Black journalists of color. And so that's something that needs to change.
Well, Tanzina Vega, thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.